The occupation of Afghanistan is now America's longest military engagement. After almost 18 years, will Donald Trump be the president who ends the war? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Ghida Fakhry. The US war in Afghanistan is almost 2 decades old. While there have been intermittent peace negotiations, none have resulted in any kind of agreement. Talks that were supposed to take place in April between the US-backed Afghan government and the Taliban were called off over disagreements over who should attend, leaving US Representative Zalmay Khalilzad to engage in shuttle diplomacy. The Afghan government has been left out of direct talks between the Taliban and the US in recent months, with the Taliban calling the Kabul government American puppets. In a few moments, we'll be joined from Afghanistan by Taliban spokesman Zabihullah Mujahid. But first, let's hear from some residents of Herat in northern Afghanistan, where what the United States has accomplished in more than 17 years remains an open question.
بهتر شده وضعیت ولی هنوز هم مشکلات هست به خصوص در بازارهای خود فروش کشمیر یا کرک که میفروشن اونقدر بازار و قیمت خوبی نداره و نمیتونه مو مصارفی که یک مالدار یا یک فارمدار هزینه میکنه.
فکر کنم که امریکا نباشه بیتره. خود مردم افغانستان میتونن خود از نوبره خود مثلا یک پالیسی کار درست کنن، امنیت خود بگیرن، آرامی برای خود جور کنن، مشکلی بزی نداره. و امریکا فکر کنم اینجا یک آمدن از اینا فکر کنم به افغانستان خیلی مفید نیست. والله برنامه‌ای که اینا طرح کردن فکر کنم منفعتی برای مردم افغانستان نداره. شاید منفعتی برای خود از اینا داشته باشه. ولی از اینا کدام منفعتی برای مردم افغانستان داره، شاید منفعتی برای خود از اینا داشته باشه. درست هیچ چیزی گفته نمیتونیم. یه باز نظر از اینا و پلیسی کاری از اینا چی بیده باشه اینجا. امریکا به افغانستان فکر کنم کدام خدمت خاصی نکرده به این مردم، فقط غیر از اینکه نظرهای خود پیاده کردن به سر از این مردم و به سر خود ریاست کشور و به سر خود همین دولت از این.
Well, despite the US military's efforts, the Taliban still control roughly half of Afghanistan. To speak about that and why the most recent round of peace talks were cancelled, we're joined by Taliban spokesman Zabihullah Mujahid. Mr. Mujahid, give us a sense of where the negotiations with the United States currently stand. Is there any progress being made? What are the key stumbling blocks?
In the name of God, the most gracious and the most merciful. The peace talks with the Americans are going great. So far, we haven't had any problems. We have to proceed with caution and precision and move slowly, because these matters are very important, and we are hopeful about reaching an agreement.
You say you're very hopeful about the future of these negotiations, but the United States has 2 very specific demands. One, they want the Taliban to stop any kind of attacks, a cessation of hostilities, as they call it, and 2, they want you to engage in intra-Afghan talks. Are you willing to accept any of these 2 demands?
What concerns us as Afghans are internal Afghan matters, and we want to solve them by ourselves after America leaves Afghanistan and their armed forces depart and Afghanistan is free. As long as our country does not have its freedom, we cannot proceed with any further matters.
Well, you say it's up to the Afghans to decide and you want to sit down with the Afghans, but how inclusive, how legitimate a deal can it be if it's simply negotiated between the Taliban and the US government without the Afghan government present. Are you willing to accept to sit down together with representative of Ashraf Ghani's government?
We have to remember that we want to sit down and talk. But like I've said before, we have to solve the foreign problems, because it is an outside issue. Afghans need to sit down and bring peace and security to our own nation. Then we will sit down amongst ourselves. President Ghani and his cabinet were created by the Americans and for the benefit of the Americans. For those Afghans that are against us, we are in very important talks, just like the ones in Qatar and Moscow, and we are hopeful. We want the Afghan people to go towards peace and security. That's our first priority.
But how does that happen if you're not accepting the idea of sitting down with the Afghan government itself? How can you negotiate directly with the United States, which still has thousands of troops in your country, and not negotiate with the legitimate government of Afghanistan?
These are two different matters, the first of which is the Americans, and we have our own problems to solve with them. They have taken our country, and there's a lot of war and fighting in our country, and our freedom has been taken from us. Our first priority is to free our country. As foreign influence leaves the country, Afghans have a need to sit down and solve our problems as Afghans in an open environment, and we cannot do that until we solve our issues with the Americans. We cannot reach an agreement with all Afghans until we deal with those problems. We do not have the freedom to sit down and come to a peace agreement until the Americans have left.
A simple yes or no question. Are you willing to sit down with the Afghan government? What will it take?
No, we do not recognize the Afghan government. They are made by the Americans and are under foreign influence. We want those Afghans that are against us to sit down and talk to us as Afghans, but not as a government.
Many Afghan women, as you know, are concerned about their future if the Taliban returns to power, if it is part of any future government. What kind of guarantees can you give Afghan women that they will not just be able to engage in peace negotiations, but also engage in Afghanistan's future public life as well if the Taliban returns to power?
They should have no worries. We are trying to answer their worries because women are an important part of our society. In daily life and in Islam, women have an important role and rights. And in Islamic law, women live freely in Afghanistan and know their rights. This isn't something they should be worried about. This is just propaganda that is spread against us and a misconception people have about us.
Are you saying that you, the Taliban, will allow women to engage in these negotiations for the future of Afghanistan and to play an important political role in the future of the country?
In Afghanistan, we have our own cultural values, and we have our religion, Islam and Islamic law. And when women become part of society and they build respect, then it is obvious women will have a part and will be joining us. They will be part of the process and join together with us as one. For example, in social work, in the medical field, these are women's needs, and the nation needs women to help build the community. This is one thing we can be in agreement with the Afghan people. We have full trust in women taking part and helping us come to solutions. When it comes to internal affairs, there are also going to be women involved, and there were women involved in the talks in Qatar and Russia.
So just to be clear, does this mean that the Taliban has changed its position towards women?
Women in Islam have their rights, and those rights we cannot change because those are God-given. And women need an opportunity because before they didn't really have an opportunity to contribute. So we are hopeful to try to provide an opportunity to help them. These are their God's given rights.
Mr. Zabihullah Mujahid, spokesman for the Taliban, thank you very much. The end of an occupation is often messy, as the Soviets learned in Afghanistan and the US has learned in Iraq and Vietnam. We'll be joined by a former US ambassador to Afghanistan and a member of the Afghan government to discuss this, but first, a short look at some relevant history.
We remain on the offensive in Afghanistan, where a fine president and a national assembly are fighting terror while building the institutions of a new democracy.
I recognize that many Americans are tired of war. I will not keep Americans in harm's way a single day longer than is absolutely required for our national security.
We've got Boeing 1-3 on station.
But we must finish the job we started in Afghanistan and end this war responsibly.
The vacuum we created by leaving too soon gave safe haven for ISIS to spread, to grow, recruit, and launch attacks. We cannot repeat in Afghanistan the mistake our leaders made in Iraq.
So how can the US leave Afghanistan without creating a new outbreak of violence? And what future does the Afghan government have? Can it defend itself against the Taliban without direct US military support? To discuss, we're joined by Barakat Rahmati, the communications chief and a political counselor at the Afghan embassy here in Washington, and Ronald Newman, a former US ambassador to Afghanistan and the author of The Other War, Winning and Losing in Afghanistan. Welcome to you both. Mr. Rahmati, to you first. For the US government, after all these years, to turn around now and suddenly decide to negotiate directly with the Taliban without making sure that the Afghan government has a seat at the table must have been a slap in the face of the government, was it?
I believe the United States have entered into discussion with the Taliban with enough and adequate discussion before they do with the Afghan government. And this is not a negotiation with the Taliban. It's about preparation for a negotiation and preparing Taliban to enter into negotiation with the Afghan government.
But still, you are the Afghan government. Doesn't this completely undermine your authority? The US is calling the shots, seemingly, after all, and the Taliban is in the driver's seat.
Look, every negotiation has three phases. There is a pre-negotiation, there is negotiation, and there is post-negotiation. Now we are in the phase of pre-negotiation. Pre-negotiations are usually a phase where every player wants to play a role, and in this specific case, it was the desire of the Afghan government that the United States persuade the Taliban, try to persuade the Taliban to come to the negotiation with the Afghan government.
But however much of a positive spin you put on this, the Afghan government, President Ashraf Ghani himself, has voiced his discontent at the fact that the Afghan government itself wasn't represented, that the Taliban won't speak with you because it views you as an American puppet. Clearly, you must be frustrated.
There are some level of frustration from the Afghan government for the Taliban not to agree on negotiation with the Afghan government, which is the purpose of current discussion between the United States and the Taliban. But that does not directly go to the US government for entering into discussion with the Taliban. That is something that the government of Afghanistan has desired, and that is what is necessary for the Afghan government and the Taliban to come together.
Ambassador Newman, how do you see it? Was this a big mistake for the United States government to engage in direct negotiations with its arch enemy, the Taliban, without making sure that the Afghan government has a seat at the table?
No, I don't think this was a mistake. I think that, in a sense, you're not putting the focus on where the nervousness is. The nervousness is about what America's purpose is. It's not about actually what is going on. So if President Trump stays where he was in the clip that I saw, that we shouldn't repeat the mistake of the past, then I think the Afghan government will be very comfortable.
But you just said something telling. You said the focus should be on what America's purpose is. Are you also suggesting that it should be simply on what America's interest is? Because clearly this undermines the interests of the Afghan government and their authority and legitimacy. It does. How does it not?
If the American interest is a stable peace which can actually be verified and implemented, then that is an interest that coincides with Afghanistan. If America's interest is redefined, it never has been defined as an interest in just getting out. If it became redefined as an interest in getting out, then it would be undermining the Afghan government.
But doesn't this smack of complete and utter desperation on the part of the United States? A fellow ambassador, whom you know, Ryan Crocker, has called it a complete surrender. Many people believe that this current framework, which was reached without the involvement of the Afghan government, is exactly that. How else can one look at it? This goes to show that the US simply wants a way out,
I think the answer is that we don't know. You know, Ambassador Khalilzad has said that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. You could put three separate meanings on that. One is, promise us anything and we'll leave. That's a disaster. Ryan Crocker would be correct. It can be the other end of the extreme. We'll show you how we're going to leave, but not until you've made peace. That would be a very strong statement. You know, you can drive a truck through the differences between these statements. I prefer to hold my fire until I see where we're going. I recognize the danger. If we just want out, this is a disaster. But that's not what we have said. It's not yet what we have done.
But was it worth it, this whole occupation? Was it worth it from an Afghan perspective? Because the US is inviting the Taliban back to the government to share power with you.
Let me tell you, it was first by the Afghan government to call upon the Taliban to come to a peace negotiation. So it is not something initiated by the United States. We have always, since 2004, persuaded and asked the Taliban to come to the discussion.
And that was true of President Karzai too, and it was true of the beginning of President Ghani's period in office, where he actually took a lot of political risk to go to Pakistan and try to begin negotiations. It didn't go well, and it hurt him politically. But you cannot say that search for negotiations is an American objective, not an Afghan. The question becomes one of what's in the details.
Do we know how many concessions the US is making?
First of all, we don't know. Secondly, I think what is happening now is the Taliban would like to get a situation where they negotiate the US out, and then they feel that they will be in a position of strength with the Afghan government. I don't think the Taliban, or at least there's no evidence that they have seriously considered many of the questions that will be difficult within their own ranks. They will have to face those difficulties only if they believe that they can't get us out without that.
But what about the US endgame, though? What about that? Because the goalposts seem to be shifting. Zalmay Khalilzad, the US envoy, seems to be now talking about simply getting an agreement, no longer withdrawing.
You know, I don't know the answer. I think my guess is that there are sort of two tendencies in the White House. One, they would like to end this war by the 2020 election, ours, and two, they don't want a bad agreement. I mean, President Trump does have to, and I think has looked, at least in Iraq, at what happens when you pull out too quickly. I personally do not think that we have a single strategy. I think we have an effort to negotiate between those two poles of tension.
How anxious are you about a peace deal being concluded? How anxious are you about the government collapsing the second the United States leaves?
We are not anxious at all, and the reason is that there can't be a peace deal concluded without the Afghan government be in the table.
But that's not what President Ghani said. About a year ago, he said that he was actually anxious that the army would not be able to sustain itself more than 6 months after the US left.
And this is if we don't have a peace negotiation. If we have a peace negotiation that ensures continuous support to the army of Afghanistan, the Afghan army has been in the battlefield, in the front row of the battlefield for 5 years. Since 2014, the entire responsibility of providing security to the Afghan people and the international community through the act of suppressing terrorism in Afghanistan has been carried out by the capable Afghanistan National Army and the National Security Forces.
Your thoughts, Ambassador Newman, because the US Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction has said this. John Sopko, he's been quite blunt. He said a dramatic decrease in not only US and coalition troops, but a dramatic decrease in financial support for the Afghan government will mean the collapse of the government. Isn't that the reality? That the Afghan government could not survive without the US propping it up both militarily and politically?
I know it makes good news to go to the extremes. That's your job.
But isn't that the reality,
I think that statement has a lot of extremes in it. You could have a pullout of combat troops. We have very few combat troops now. as long as you have the American air power and some connectivity on the ground to call airstrikes, I know something about that. Long ago in my misspent youth, I was an infantry officer and called airstrikes. You can maintain the Afghan forces just fine. And we're slowly developing an Afghan Air Force. You don't necessarily, but if you cut off everything, if you cut off money and air and troops, cut off everything at one time, yes, you'd probably provoke a disaster. But if you keep money, you keep some troops, you keep some air, I think reality simply doesn't lie in the extremes.
So the reality means the U.S. will never be able to leave?
Well, never is a long time.
Let me tell you a trajectory that has happened during the past few years. The Afghan government, the Afghan people are taking additional responsibility, and this eventually will come to a point, and we expect that this will come to a point by a few more years, maybe 4 or 5 more years, that the Afghan government will be capable of financing its own security forces.
Do you agree with that, Ambassador? Do you feel, talking about trajectory, that they have met their targets?
They are taking a larger role. I'm dubious that they can get to the point of financing the whole army. But after all, Afghanistan has not financed its own army entirely out of its resources in 150 years. From Abdul Rahman, who had British subsidies, right up until the present. Every Afghan army has that. But you asked another question about leaving. And I think, yes, we might be there a long time. A sustainable presence might be much smaller than it is now. After all, we'll lose. You know, it's a horrible thing. We lost about 12 people dead last year. We lost 80 in non-combat training casualties outside Afghanistan. So this is a perfectly sustainable.
But what about the Afghan casualties and the cost to the Afghan people themselves?
The Afghan casualties are high. But one of the huge differences when you talked about occupation is that there is no major groundswell of public opinion against the American and NATO and international presence. There are pockets. People would be happier if they didn't have a war.
Who's asking them? But would you accept that the situation? Would you accept,
the
Ambassador?
Asia Foundation survey and
would you accept, though, that the situation you leave behind is worse than what you inherited when you went in?
When we went in, no. I mean, when you went in and there was no school system, there was no clinical system, there was a civil war going on and a medieval regime. I would not say that it is worse. I would also say that we have paid a considerable price for having tried to go too fast. President Obama cut off all air support to the Afghan forces in 2014, and he kept trying to pull out troops too quickly, and then he reversed that decision in November 2016 because we were about to lose the war. So it's one thing to say you want out, it's another thing to make gross mistakes in how you carry it out.
From the Afghan perspective, was it worthwhile?
Absolutely. I've grown in a society, an open society. I've had the opportunity to get world-class education. I've had the opportunity to go to clinic for my health requirements. My kids grown up in Afghanistan, getting all the support that a government can get. And this has been not available for my father. This has not been available for many generations before me. So this has been for the Afghan government a blessing, what I would call a great opportunity to bring and build a new Afghanistan, and that is what you see today. I think Afghanistan is a totally transformed country. Compare Afghanistan of 2001 and Afghanistan of 2019.
Let me compare. What about the fact that Afghanistan today is one of the top 10 most corrupt countries? That's according to Transparency International. In fact, it ranked 172 out of 180 countries. What about the fact that Afghanistan ranked second in 2018 among countries most impacted by terrorism? In fact, it took the place of Iraq as the country most affected by terrorism in 2017. That's according to Global Terrorism Index. That's not a very pretty picture.
And what about the infant mortality rates that have decreased extensively in Afghanistan? What about the education? What about 30% of women in the Afghan parliament? What about 200 free TV channels in Afghanistan? What about all of other progress that Afghanistan has made? So you cannot just see Afghanistan through one sharp and narrow lens. You have to see the whole spectrum. Afghanistan, and that's exactly why the Afghan people, as Ambassador highlighted, think that at this moment, the presence of the international security forces is necessary for Afghanistan, and they want to see their democracy, continue and flourish the way it has been going on for the past many years.
Ambassador Ronald Newman and Barakat Rahmati, thank you both very much indeed.
Great, it was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, will it be possible for the US to ensure the survival of the government it set up once it leaves? Recent history suggests the government's position is extremely tenuous, especially with the Taliban at its strongest since it was deposed in 2001, with regional and international powers protecting their own interest and dictating the terms of any peace agreement. Does a weakened and sidelined Afghan government have any chance? From me, Ghida Fakhry, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.